Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
All right, welcome to another edition of American Potential. Thanks for being with us. I'm at the all-staff meeting for Americans for Prosperity in Orlando, Florida. I don't know, 500-600 people, I think, is the number that I heard. It's a staggering number of people, patriots really, who are doing such great work around the country from all the state chapters around America. And we're trying to bring you some of their stories. You know, that's what's so great about this podcast. We're bringing these individual stories to you, and I'm honored to be a part of that. And we've got a great one today. We've talked so much about education because it can go so wrong in education, but once someone gets empowered in education, it can go so right. And we see that so often. When you try and make a student fit a system, it may or it may not work. But what if the student was able to find a system that worked best for their individual learning style? And what if we stop passing students to the next grade until they've mastered the material? Today's podcast guest is a young man who had a tough childhood and a school system that kept passing him on to the next grade without him understanding the material, which just continued to add to his frustrations. He and his two sisters were raised by a single mom, and at the age of 10, their dad was deported back to El Salvador. That's a lot to deal with for a kid. Needless to say, he was angry, and angry kids don't do well. He had some emotional problems, and after one of his outbursts at school, his teacher told him he wouldn't amount to anything. Imagine being told that by a teacher. Despite the teacher, he did find a subject that he was good at, and he enjoyed spending time on it. But it took until his junior year of high school to find the learning environment that worked best for him. And after high school, he went on to join the U.S. Marines, where he was assigned to Marine One. And after 4 years of serving, he left the Marines and decided to go work in politics. Joshua Solano is the Deputy State Director of Minnesota for Americans for Prosperity. He's our podcast guest on this episode today. Joshua, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to find out a little bit more. Thanks for your service as a U.S. Marine.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. So you were awarded the Presidential Service Badge in the Obama administration. Then you went on to serve in the Trump administration as well. So you were on Marine One?
Yeah, so I ended up, my background is aviation supply and logistics.
Okay.
So I went through boot camp, combat school, down to tech school in Meridian, Mississippi, of all places, where I actually competed against 14 Marines for a special assignment. We weren't told what that special assignment would be.
Right.
And on the last day of that schooling, they basically said, "Hey, Josh," or at the time, actually, "Hey, Private."
That was your first name back then.
Hey, Private Solano. I might have been a private first class at the time, but "Hey, Solano, you leave in 1 hour. We're sending you to Quantico." So I went to Quantico. I was with the Marine One from 2014 to 2018. 2 years with the Obama administration, 2 years with the Trump administration. When you receive your full background checks, your top security, secret security clearances, and then you work there for a specific amount of time, then the administration awards you with the Presidential Service Badge. So started off in logistics, and then I left as the Chief of Personnel and Administration for the Supply Department, where I manned 40 Marines, sailors, and civilians. And we directly supported the helicopters that the president flies on. So it was an honor to travel with them to states and support their, OCONUS trips overseas when they're meeting with heads of state. It was a really unique experience most people don't experience while they're in the Marine Corps, I would say. But it was an honor to serve two presidents.
You probably have a cool story about that.
There's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of cool stories. I mean, the amount of, they do a lot of, there's, incentive programs and things like that for good works. And
sure,
I would say, some of the coolest stories are when you are given a reward of saying hey, President is hosting the Greek ambassador at the White House today, and we would like you to go and represent Marine One. And I can't tell you how many events that I've gone to, meeting foreign dignitaries, going to special events, meeting celebrities at, Christmas parties and things like that. And so I think, it's 4 years of just a culmination of meeting some of the coolest people of all different backgrounds from around the world. It's a very unique experience that I think that most people don't understand, that the White House is a big place. It employs a lot of people. And there's, 7,000 people that support the president. And it's just kind of a wild thing to think about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I have a few interactions from my time working on Capitol Hill and then elsewhere where I interact. And it is kind of it's almost a surreal feeling, because it's his voice. Like when you hear the president talk in another room or something, it's the voice you hear every day on TV or whatever, but it's like right next to you. It's just kind of a weird thing, isn't it?
Well, yeah. And there's like a breakdown of character, like when the cameras are off and you are meeting them, shaking their hands when they're thanking you, because, I would say the best thing about, at least, I only directly supported 2 presidents, but when the cameras are off and the doors are closed and they go through the Marines or, the Air Force personnel, and just the nonpartisan staff at the White House.
Yeah, right.
It's like this barrier comes off of them, and you kind of really see how funny they are, or just like their quirks and their personalities, and they get really relaxed, and you kind of find out, their favorite drinks or their favorite snacks. And it's just very interesting to be in that environment, because that's when the cameras are off and you're not really necessarily watching the president, eat pistachios on a helicopter. And it's just like, it's a very interesting experience,
Yeah. I know we want to get to your story, but what's your favorite story that you can tell us about either President Obama or President Trump that just kind of gave you a window into who they are?
Yeah. I would say that, a lot of the meetings that I had, or, just like support with the Obama administration, was very professional. But I did have an experience with President Trump, and it actually was the last day that I left service at the White House, where they come in and you get the opportunity, and I had been to the East Wing dozens and dozens of times in support and on the South Lawn and everything. But each president makes it a point that when you are leaving office, when you're, support of the White House, that they're going to shake your hand one last time, that they're going to thank you. And they're going to, give you a short conversation. So I would say, one of the most personable experiences I had was going to the West Wing, doing that tour and everything that everyone loves. I love history and I love the White House and institutions. I'm an institutionalist through and through. So that was an honor, but it's stepping into the Oval Office and shaking the hand of, at the time when I left, it was President Donald Trump, shaking their hand and them, thanking you, but then having a candid conversation, for just a couple of minutes while the, White House photographer gets ready for a picture and everything. And just having that really personal moment of saying, President Donald Trump, for instance, you may not have, served my administration the entire time because I left halfway through. But I genuinely thank you for your service and the time that you've, put into this country and this institution. And that was probably the best moment, was my last day, because sometimes, especially in the military, you feel like you hear "thank you for your service" a lot. Mm-hmm. And until it really means something from the top, is where I really said, that is recognizable. Yeah. It's something that's really emotional, because there's a lot of blood and a lot of sweat and a lot of tears going into serving your country. And that recognition is just incredible.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's a great story. I love to hear those kinds of stories, so it kind of connects people to who they are. And you realize when you're around people like that, whether it's the president or a member of Congress or what, they're regular people, mm-hmm. right? They have the same things that happen in their life, that, they have good days and bad days and all of that stuff. So that's awesome. So let's talk about you growing up. Obviously, I told a little bit about your story, and we had this sort of one-size-fits-all school system that you didn't do well in. And then it wasn't until you found a better way to educate yourself that that you really started thriving. But I'm sure that wasn't easy. How did that affect your ability to learn?
I mean, it affected everything. My father was an immigrant from El Salvador. My first language wasn't English. And so, it was one of those things where my mom made it a point to go to Gap. So I went, to preschool and all of that, learn socialization, try to learn English as much as possible. But, early on, I had learning issues, comprehension issues, especially with math and numbers and reading. And going through the second grade, that's when the school decided to put me into intensive ESL for second language learners. And I was always behind. By third grade. I'd done really well getting ahead in reading comprehension and writing and speaking. And but I fell in other areas like math. And by the time I was in fifth grade, I'd never progressed beyond third grade math. It was just something that kind of like the teacher tried to spend extra time on me, but the classroom sizes and everything like that are a little too big. And I remember when I was in fifth grade, one of my main teachers said, I just don't know why you don't get it. You've had since third grade to learn how to do this division or how to do kind of like this really simple algebra kind of, or square roots. And I just never, and I can't do square roots to this day, but I don't know who can
either. I don't know that one.
I don't know who can.
I can't do it either.
But it's like one of those things to where you sit there and you just kind of, you have teachers, people that are supposed to be, there to, construct a learning environment that makes you excel. And by the time I was in fifth grade, my father had already been arrested and then he was on his way to deportation by the time I was 10 years old. I was a really troubled kid. I had a lot of angry outbursts, like you said before. It was a very emotional time, and that would go through, for any kid, there's a lot of families in this country that, come from immigrants and, the story isn't always a happy ending. And that, that affects the family life. It affects the home life. And that goes directly into problems at school. And so I do remember after that incident, that fifth grade teacher towards the end of the school year told me the only reason why I'm going to middle school is because of No Child Left Behind. Otherwise he would have, failed me. And so then I think it was at that moment that at least my mom also recognized that the system was failing, something was wrong. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't have progressed. I was facing issues. There should have been counseling or mental help and things like that, but there also should have been a system to where I learned how to do math or science correctly. And instead, I decided that I was just going to be good at one or two things because I could skate on by. I could just get to the next grade level. There's no worries. A D is fine. But there's no excellence in that. There's no progressing skills because the whole point of education is that you become well-rounded. Mm-hmm. And you learn those skills so that you can go on to college or the military or, straight to work or straight to trades. But there was no well-roundedness for me, if that's a word. But there were, I had to rely heavily on two things that found that I was just below average. And some teachers tried to help, but I would say, there was a sixth grade teacher, told me that I was going to fail. A seventh grade teacher told me that I was going to fail, that I was never going to make it. All the way through, it got so bad, my mom decided to pull me out because she was planning on moving. She was just planning on leaving the state, leaving the country even to go live with family in Israel. Mm-hmm. So she pulled me out to homeschool. And because she was a single mom working two jobs, that was difficult in itself.
Sure.
And it worked for my sisters. Homeschool worked so much better for my sisters than traditional schooling did. But for me, even that environment wasn't helpful. And so I feel like I've had so many different experiences with traditional schooling, and then trying to homeschool and trying to find this niche that worked for me. And it wasn't until, like you said, I was a junior. There's a magnet school in the public school system in the district that I grew up in, where their entire system is completely different. It was supported by the public school system, District 196, and they pulled from all 4 high schools in the district. But their learning structure and their learning style was completely different. It was based off of debate and comprehension and public speaking and writing and essays. There was no tests. The tests were essays, or the tests were speeches or debates between instructors or peers. And I really thrived in that environment. And it wasn't until then that I figured out that those are my inherent skills. The way that I learned was through that long form teaching, and spending 3 hours, because they called it, home time, because there was houses in it. But it was 3-hour lessons. And I needed that. I was a student that needed that extra time.
Yeah.
I needed 3-hour lessons to understand the world around me. And 25-minute 9 periods a day I'm not going to learn algebra in 25 minutes, once a week with 9 other periods I'm worried about with 12 hours of homework for all 9 periods. It's just, I don't know. 98% of students may succeed in that, but there's, I think, a small portion of kids that are, they learn like me. They take extra time and it's different, but So
this changed your life. This literally changed your life by being just in a different system, different learning environment, different school.
Absolutely. And other, there were some students that transferred to that school in junior, because it was a junior and senior year school only. And there were some students that, if they didn't make it, a month or 2 months, but they were able to transfer back to their high school and carry over the credit or the work that they were already doing. So they didn't lose out on that education. It's just that they came because they wanted a different experience or different style of learning in classes, but it wasn't for them. And they went, back to their home high schools and they excelled there. But that's, I think, what's important about this message is you should have the right to try these different things. Whether or not you're going to succeed in a magnet school like I went to, you should be able to try that different learning environment, and for the students that it didn't work, they succeeded and excelled in an environment that did work for them. I just found that I thrived in that environment. And towards the end of senior year, I found out that because I was so bad at math, I was missing math credits and science credits. And I had to leave that school. I had to leave that environment to go back to a home high school and do classes as much as I was excelling so well at my magnet school that when I went back, my GPA dropped almost immediately because I was back in that environment trying to make up for the math credits before, graduation. And it just proved that it was the experiment of school that was successful for me. So I think that's the message of just, there's a lot of experiences that people have. Whether it's your home life that affects your educational experience, or whether it's just simply the style of instruction, the style of school. You should have that choice. You should be able to say, does homeschool work for me? Does a charter school work for me? Does a magnet school or private school or, maybe this public school doesn't work for me, but the public school next door in the next county may work.
And it may not work for family members the same, right? Sounds like for your sister, the homeschooling was a really good option.
Absolutely.
Worked great for them.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think that's really key is kids are unique and there's a lot of comparative advantage. I'm going to throw that word out there, but there's a lot of unique individual skills that make students and kids just thrive. If they're not good at one thing, but they're super good at math or they're super good at sciences, there should be a STEM option for those kids. Right? That was not going to be for me. I can tell you right now, I wasn't going to a STEM school. But those options should be available and parents should be able to give those children the opportunity.
So after you graduated high school, you didn't want to go to college?
No, because I just let everyone, even friends and family, tell me that, you barely graduated. Why would you go back? Why would you go back to an environment of you're just going to hate it? you know, I think you're going to hate college. Why would you do that? And so I just sat on my thumbs for 9 months, and I really fed into that. I really fed into that, calling back to those teachers saying that I'm never going to make it, or I'm never going to be anything. And that, you know, your childhood dreams are just not going to make any sense. If you're not good, how are you going to be? Because, you know, ever since I was 12 years old, I wanted to get into politics.
Right.
And, you know, you'd have instructors and friends, you know, be, you know, you're never going to get into the Naval Academy with that mindset because you're not good at anything. And so I really let that eat at me. And so I just didn't go to college because of that negativity. I found a home and I found a family in the Marine Corps. Believe it or not, I was 285 pounds. I was a really big kid. And even then, when I showed up into the Marine office, they were like, "Oh, are you looking for the Air Force office? Like, yeah, I don't know if you can run 3 miles today."
Shot across the bow for those of you in the Air Force, right? But he's a Marine. That's what they do.
But, you know, I think I finally let the naysayers have it.
Yeah.
And you know, they said, "We're just going to run 4 miles today. Can you make it?" And I was like, "We'll see." I made it maybe 1/4 mile before I just like completely broke down.
Right.
And, you know, I went back the next day and they were surprised, and I just kept going back. And I ended up joining the Marine Corps like 9 months later. And I found that maybe my skills and my perseverance tied right into how I found my educational experience of needing the time. You know, a staff sergeant at the time, actually later on, said, "You know what? I'm just going to give this kid extra time. And I'm going to teach him about what the Marine Corps is all about. I'm going to teach about our life skills, our working skills. And I'm going to pay attention to him because he's very serious about this." And I found that their teaching environment, while rough sometimes and harsh, matched the way that I found how I learned in school at that magnet school, of needing that 3 extra hours of instruction. That's what matched for me, you know? And so that carries on beyond school. The way that you learn in K through 12, that learning style is never going to change for me.
Right.
You know, work today. Sometimes I can get an email from a supervisor or someone at headquarters, and I just don't understand what they're talking about. But if I can sit down in a room,
I get those all the time.
And I get those all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if I can sit down in a room and really hash it out with my peers, or hash it out with, you know, someone who is my peer, but doing instruction on the topic, that's how I really grasp the situation, so I can disseminate that information to my team, and I can really drive and be a leader. So the way you learn foundational education in this country carries on through your working life, through your working experience. The way I learn is never going to change.
Right.
And I wish that option was there for when I needed to learn English in 2nd grade.
Right.
I wish that it was there that when I needed to learn math in 3rd grade. If we had caught that at 3rd grade, maybe, you know, I wouldn't have been sent back to my home high school when I could have finished at that magnet school. You know? So I think you have to catch it really early on.
Right.
Because kids show you their talents, and that carries through your life.
Right. So you were 4 years in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then after that, you decided to go to Minnesota, go back to Minnesota and get into politics, which you said you always wanted to do from the time you were 12. Let me go back quickly to when you were 12. What made you want to get into politics?
You know, so I come from a very activist family.
Yeah.
It's wild, actually. So, you know, my grandparents have always been in the conservative political sphere, running for state delegate in Minnesota. We have a weird BPOU system.
Yeah.
Minnesota
has the weirdest political system I've ever. It's like not. What's your Democrat party?
Yeah, we don't even have Democrats.
What is it?
Democratic Farmer Labor Party.
Yes, that's weird.
Yeah. Yes. It's weird. So we've always been weird. I mean, even during the time of Nixon, we didn't have Republicans. Right. We had IRs, which is just, we've always been a weird political state. So politics is kind of ingrained differently from other states. It's almost like its own culture and its own society. But my grandparents always were very active politically. I do remember, you know, them signing me up to be in a parade at 10 years old, you know, and just like walking for a local state senator candidate that they were friends with or something. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you know, you have my mom and my sisters who are very in tune activists to the left. You know, they were huge activists for Congresswoman Sharice Spear in Kansas, and the Women's Walk and all of that. And then you have, you know, my stepdad, who's just a libertarian and wants to be left alone. But I come from a very, very dynamic family, and politics started really, really early on. And actually at that magnet school, we had J terms. And so in January, I was able to take a class specific that was called Capital Policy and Law. And I spent a month, my classroom was the state capitol. We shadowed the state senators and the state representatives, and we weren't, you know, pages, but learning about the process, sitting in committees, listening to the floor debates, meeting with our legislators at, you know, 16 years old.
What a great way to learn.
What a great way to learn. And it was something that I was passionate about because I had always, and I know it sounds horrible, but for a kid who had no control in his life, I'd always looked up to politicians, which is a horrible statement to do now that I'm older. But that was how I looked at it because, you know, you come from a life where there was no control and they looked like they had all the control. So I'd always been, you know, drawn to it. And, you know, at the end of that J term, I didn't have a test. I had a speech and an essay about what I learned, what was my thoughts going through, what was being debated, and what my opinion was on that. And that's just such an interesting style of learning. So I feel like I've been in the political sphere for a long time in my family. They're always fighting for something different. And
sounds like they're fighting at least, right? I mean, you must have very interesting discussions.
Yeah, even today. I mean, I will say sometimes I would say at family dinners and Thanksgivings or Passovers, and the conversations can be a little weird. And sometimes I will be the bad guy and shut down the conversations because I believe in bridging divides. But eventually they all kind of just realize that they want the same thing. And that's for people to achieve their greatest potential, right? You know, like my sisters may be really left on the left side of the spectrum, but I respect their tenacity. And I respect that they care so much about their country that I can have a conversation with them. We may not always agree on some issues, but I would like to believe that, you know, they do love me, but they also believe that I care for this country and that I want it to continue. I want to continue this great experiment, you know, and I think that's the difference of how I view things with people, you know, on the opposing side is I do know that they care.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm talking to a legislator under the dome in St. Paul, I know that maybe they come from a really hard blue district, but I know that that representative or that senator represents that district. They voted for them through and through, maybe 70, 80% wins, but I also know that they care and there may be a conversation that happens from that.
Yeah.
So always been inherently political. And maybe that's kind of where I learned my learning. Maybe that's where my learning style comes from is long form debates and learning through a shared experience.
Yeah.
You know,
it seems like maybe in your family, it skips a generation. Sounds like your grandparents were kind of more on the conservative side. Maybe your mom, not so much.
Yeah.
And then you're more on the conservative. Maybe it's
who knows?
Deal.
Yeah, it could be. I could be honestly, seriously, but I also think it's just because I had the freedom to do it. I had the freedom to make my own choices. My mom is not a pushy individual.
Yeah.
She just loves that I care. And she just loves that, you know, she reposts my posts on Instagram, even though I'm meeting with someone she may not agree with at all.
Yeah. Well, she's proud of you, I'm sure.
You know, it's the support. And, you know, it starts in the family. It really does. Supporting your kids and supporting their choices and being there, at least if they're good choices, you know, to that degree. But I think that that's what really allowed me to experiment, you know, going back to education, experiment with that. The way that I could find schooling is the way that I could make my own decisions and finding out what works for you, finding out what you care about.
Sure.
You know? And I think that, you know, my sisters and I, we couldn't be so different.
Yeah.
And they had different learning experiences. And I don't know the statistics of it, but, you know, are homeschool kids, you know, statistically more conservative? Who knows? But they didn't certainly turn out that way. Right. So it's one of those things that the way you're brought up really affects how you are and how you learn and how you work and your contributions to society.
Yeah.
I think that's what's important is, are you a contributing member?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's been, what a great story. I mean,
Thanks.
An amazing story. And we're sort of out of time. It goes so quick when we start talking about these things. There's probably a lot more we could talk about.
Yeah.
I was thinking of all these other questions, but we probably will end it there. But awesome story. And it always highlights, I always love stories that highlight how a different learning environment is different for individual kids. And what I'm always struck by is we have put families in a certain school district based on their zip code, when in reality, their own kids probably benefit most from being in probably different learning environments, because their kids are all individuals. And we've got to break that mold. And that's the power of your story, right? Is just, and it wouldn't have been right to force your sisters into the learning environment that you had, because they wouldn't have thrived in it. Right?
Oh, absolutely not. And my sisters will tell you right now, they can't write, 50-page essays. That's just not for them. They are test takers.
Do they know the square root of a number?
Maybe one of my sisters speaks 7 languages, and I definitely don't speak 7 languages. So
I would say, Joshua, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
I appreciate it. Well, what a great story Joshua has. You have that same sort of story that talks about breaking barriers, and in many cases, government-imposed barriers, where Joshua went up against a system that was telling him he couldn't succeed, because that system is focused on fixing it for all kids, when in reality, kids are different. Kids are individual. And fortunately for Joshua and for America, he found the way that works best for him. So thanks for listening to Joshua's story. Thanks for listening to American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.